Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. It's been 20 months since negotiations have started between Iran and the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Germany over Iran's nuclear program. A partial deal was reached in April, and now we're in the final stretch of negotiations taking place in Vienna. Our guest today joins us from this very place where the negotiations are taking place. His name is Trita Parsi. He's the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Mr. Parsi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So one thing is sure, there was a June 30th deadline, but this deadline will not be met. The negotiations are going to continue. Is this a good sign, or should we worry?
I don't think it's a bad sign. At the end of the day, I think it's quite clear the June 30th deadline was actually never truly considered the deadline. In fact, if you take a look at the schedule of the various foreign ministers, some of them are not even arriving until after today. So it's quite clear that they never viewed this as the real deadline. The real deadline is going to come in about a week's time because of the congressional deadline that has been imposed on these negotiations. If the talks go beyond July 10th, then the review process in Congress is going to increase with an additional 30 days. That's something that all parties want to avoid. So as a result, the target deadline is actually to try to get something done by July 7th or 8th, and then have enough time for the Americans to make that report to the Senate by July 10th. So that's the target deadline, not June 30th.
So, a very simple question. Is it a realistic deadline? The fact that foreign ministers are coming to this very place where you're standing in front of, is this a good sign? It means there have been so many discussions. Is it just a matter of finalizing a document, or are there still major roadblocks?
There are roadblocks, there are disagreements, but what is interesting, however, is that none of the disagreements that seem to be separating the two sides at this point are more complex or more difficult than the previous roadblocks that they actually have succeeded in resolving. So as a result, there is reason to be optimistic and seeing that there is a decent chance of being able to get this done. I think odds are on the fact that there will be a deal. The question is, will it be before July 10th or will it be after July 10th?
The Iranian Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif went back to Tehran very quickly. He returned to Vienna, not alone actually, with the head of Iran's atomic agency and with the brother of President Hassan Rouhani. This trip, was he trying to validate something with the supreme leader in Iran? We know the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is the one who makes the final decision on those issues.
There seems to have been some process in which, of course, they're having consultations and discussions in Tehran. The Supreme Leader came out with a tweet just an hour or so ago endorsing the negotiating team and very strongly backing them. So the idea that he went back there and had some discussions in and of itself not particularly newsworthy. All of the various foreign ministers have on numerous occasions left the city, gone back and come here again. This is the first time the Iranian foreign minister does this, but it is a rather normal occurrence.
So let's go back to those roadblocks, especially the issue of the verification of the agreement and basically the inspections of suspicious sites. Is this something that can be resolved? Obviously, the Iranians don't want too many inspections because they're sensitive sites. We heard a U.S. official who was not quoted say that it would not concern all military sites. Do you think there is room for an agreement to have an inspection regime that would be intrusive enough for the West, but acceptable for Iran?
Frankly, I think there's far more agreement on this point than the media narrative has suggested. In fact, I think part of the issue here is that there's been some language in some interviews by some officials in which they essentially gave the impression that the discussion from the outset was about inspections that were actually never truly the ones that were being discussed. I would direct you to the interview that President Obama himself gave to the New York Times within days after the Lausanne framework, in which he explained very much in detail the process of managed access as it is spelled out in the additional protocol. The Iranians will accept that. They have accepted that in the past. That is in and of itself not an issue. What has become an issue is that there's been an impression given that that managed access means that there's anytime, anywhere inspections. That is not the case. I think there's a reason why from the American side one has tried to walk that back. They never intended to signal that. That was never part of the agreement, and I don't think that's going to be a major issue in the talks going forward.
So another roadblock that is often mentioned is the sanctions, to be more precise, the lifting of sanctions against Iran. There are a variety of sanctions, national, international ones. Obviously, Tehran wants an immediate lifting of those sanctions. The West says, well, we need to trust but verify, and having sanctions progressively removed is the way to go. There again, is there really room for an agreement, or is this, for you, the main roadblock?
I don't think it is a major roadblock. Again, on that issue, that seems to have been resolved. There is an agreement on certain principles of this in the sense that there will be an agreement in which the Western side will go forward and declare that they're going to lift sanctions. The Iranians are going to simultaneously start the process of implementing some of the agreements, and the sanctions will be lifted. There's already been a set agreement on how these different dates work, so that is in and of itself not a major roadblock. What I think is a roadblock is after that, once the initiation of sanctions have taken place, how will the additional sanctions after that, at what point will they be lifted? Moreover, what is the guarantee that is being provided that the lifting of sanctions actually also will mean that the true impediments to trade will be lifted? We know from the experience of the JPOA, the interim agreement, that even though sanctions were lifted or some transactions were permitted, there was still a lot of confusion in the banking system in which a lot of the banks were not comfortable doing this because they were not entirely sure that they could do so. Moreover, there are it's not just the US Congress that have imposed sanctions on Iran. Other entities have done so as well within the United States. What happens to these things? So there's a lot of question marks on that. It's not necessarily roadblocks or major impediments. As I mentioned earlier on, the problems that remain are less complex than the problems that already have been resolved.
So besides those 2 points, the sanctions and the inspections regime, what other problems that still need to be ironed out do you see?
Well, I mean, I think these are mainly the problems that exist, and I think the schedule of the sanctions relief going forward after the initiation is probably one of the bigger issues right now, in which that needs to be settled. It needs to have the same degree of clarity and guarantee, probably, as the guarantees that are given when it comes to inspections. They should, I think it would be difficult to get an agreement if there is an asymmetric situation in which the degree of detail when it comes to inspections are very, very high, but the degree of detail when it comes to sanctions relief is of far lesser nature. That could create problems, because what you don't want to have an agreement that leaves too much room for interpretation, too many misunderstandings, and then you end up having a major problem 6 months down the road. It lies in the interest of all sides to make sure that this is a durable agreement, and that means that all of these loose ends need to be resolved, not just the one that comes to enrichment and the nuclear issue, but also the ones when it comes to sanctions.
Last question, if there is an agreement, what comes after? Is it more difficult for President Barack Obama to sell it, quote unquote, to Congress than it will be for the Iranian negotiators to sell it to their own public?
I don't think the Iranians will have a difficulty selling it to the public. The public in Iran is strongly in favor of this. Obviously, they too will be sensitive if they think that the agreement has given up too much, or if there's a sense that the agreement violates Iran's dignity. The problem that the Iranians face is coming more so from some elements within the political elite that will oppose it. But the public itself is not going to be a major issue. On the American side, the problems in Congress remain, and they are quite worrisome. Part of the reason why the July 9th deadline is important is because if they pass it and you have an additional 30 days added to the review process, it means that Congress is going to take up to 82 days to review this issue. That gives the opponents of this deal in Washington, D.C. plenty of time to do their mobilizing and their lobbying to strip away senator after senator that currently may be backing Obama, to push them into the opposition camp. And that would be a major problem, because if the Senate at the end of the day does not come out either endorsing the deal or failing to stop it, then you're going to have a major issue, because there's not going to be any real sanctions lifting on the American side unless Congress is involved in it.
So obviously what happens in Vienna is crucial, but what happens then, if a deal is reached in Washington, is maybe even more crucial. Trita Parsi, thank you very much for taking some time from those negotiations and joining us here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.